Morning, everybody. Welcome to the Tanner Symposium. We are thrilled to have you here. We're thrilled to be able to continue our conversation from a really enjoyable, engaging, and enriching Tanner lecture from yesterday. So as people walk in, I have the distinct honor of serving as moderator, and that gives me a moment just to introduce our three panelists, and well, actually we have 3.5 panelists. We have a ghost panelist, which I'll explain in just a moment, and of course, our wonderful Tanner Lecture recipient or giver, depending on one's view. Let me start with the Tanner Lecture for this year. It's Elaine Landemore, who's a professor of political science at Yale University, who specializes in political theory. Her research and teaching interests include, among other things, democratic theory, political epistemology, ethics, and the politics of artificial intelligence. She's also a fellow at the Ethics in AI Institute at the University of Oxford and an advisor to the Democratic Inputs at AI program at OpenAI. As those of you who had a chance to hear the lecture know, from yesterday, she served on the governance committee of the most recent French Citizens Convention and is currently undertaking work supported by the Schmidt's Future through AI 2050 program. And we are thrilled to welcome her to Michigan. Among our three panelists, one of our panelists unfortunately was taken ill just at the last moment. So Professor Don Herzog will be here by comments. That is, he has sent his comments, but will not be here in person. As a quick moment, just to be grateful for his work and his comments, let me mention that Don Herzog is the Edson R. Sunderland Professor of Law, my colleague at the law school. His main teaching interests are political, moral, legal, and social theory, alongside constitutional interpretation, torts, and the First Amendment. He's the author of numerous books, including Sovereignty, Rest in Peace, and a little book of political mistakes. I could go on, but we are grateful to Don, and I convey his regrets on his behalf. But it is a sign of the richness of the University of Michigan that when Don Herzog goes down, we can just slide in Elizabeth Anderson. It's quite remarkable. So Elizabeth Anderson will be delivering Don Herzog's remarks, but then of course will be in her own voice as a commentator during the Q&A. So in that way, we are, what's the Shakespeare line? Twice blessed. Elizabeth Anderson is the Arthur F. Tourneau Professor and John Dewey Distinguished University Professor of Philosophy and of Women and Gender Studies. She's also the Max Shea Professor of Public Philosophy. She teaches in ethics, social and political philosophy, political economy, philosophy of social science, and feminist theory. Her research is distinguished in focusing on democratic theory, equality in political philosophy, American law, racial integration, the ethical limits of markets, and much, much more. Pragmatism needs mentioning, and feminist epistemology and philosophy of science. She's currently working on the history of egalitarianism and challenges to creating a society of equals. She also designed and is the first director of our program in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, our PPE program. And so we're grateful for you stepping in at the last moment. Thank you, Liz. Right, skipping over our Tanner lecturer, we have Kyla Evels-Duggan, who is the Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Brady Program in Ethics and Civic Life at Northwestern University. She works in moral and political philosophy and their history, and has written on love, political liberalism, Kant's moral and political philosophy, and his philosophy of religion and philosophy of education. She's currently working on not one, but 2 book projects, the first concerning value attitudes and the second on moral philosophy, the moral philosophy of Iris Murdoch, and we had the pleasure of being reminded that we were colleagues in undergrad here as well. So that's a great joy to see you again, not just after undergrad, but after some crossing paths after. Certainly not least, as they say, last but not least, we're thrilled that Anne Phillips, who's the Professor Emerita at the London School of Economics, has joined us. She was previously the Graham Wallace Professor of Political Science, and previous to that, she was the director of LSE's Gender Institute. She is a leading figure in feminist political theory and has written extensively on issues of equality, democracy, and representation. Her major publications include The Politics of Presence, What Equalities Matter, Multiculturalism Without Culture, The Politics of the Human, and Unconditional Equals. Among her many awards, she was elected as a Fellow of the British Academy in 2003 and the Commission of the UK Academy of Social Sciences in 2012. And in 2016, she was awarded the Sir Isaiah Berlin Prize for lifetime contribution to political studies. We are thrilled to have such a distinguished group and such a wonderful set of, a wonderful lecture on which they can comment. Let's welcome everybody and get started. The panelists will speak for roughly 20 minutes. We'll have a response of roughly the same, and then open it up for Q&A. If somebody will remind me the order we just chose.
I'm gonna go first.
All yours.
Thank you, it's wonderful to be here. I was an undergraduate here. My philosophical soul was born here, so it's wonderful to be back. We had said we were going to speak from there, but now I feel like you're all over here. I'm gonna stay here. So in her lecture, Professor Landemore argues that love has an essential role to play in politics. She contrasts love and emotion more generally with reasoning and other intellectual and cognitive resources and skills. But though she thinks that emotion and cognition are different, she certainly does not think that they are opposed. Far from it, she argues that they are interrelated and mutually supporting. A central claim of her talk is that we need love in order to arrive together at truth. Landemore's talk also contains an argument in favor of replacing some part of electoral politics with deliberative citizens' assemblies. The citizens' assemblies that she takes as her model are short-term endeavors focused on a particular issue or policy area. These assemblies consist in a small number of citizens coming together over multiple meetings in which they learn from experts and from each other. They deliberate together to arrive at recommendations that may then be considered for enactment by the elected legislature or by referendum. The participants in such assemblies represent a cross-section of the population and are chosen by random selection rather than by competitive election. Landemore argues that this procedure eliminates the competitive incentives that shape electoral alternatives. Electoral politics create incentives to prevail over opponents and amass power for one's own group, team, faction, or party. This creates structural reasons to suppress any inconvenient truths. And we know that increasingly, both domestic and foreign political actors are actively undercutting American politics with disinformation that is meant to mislead or at least confuse voters. Thus, there are clear ways in which electoral politics undermine rather than advance epistemic values. Shifting power from elected officials to randomly selected citizens' assemblies removes, or at least mitigates, these perverse incentives. But Landemore is even more hopeful about the potential of such assemblies. She hopes that they will not only undercut bad incentives, but also create good ones, giving rise to an environment of genuinely shared deliberation and a joint commitment to arriving at truth. Of most interest to her are the personal bonds of affection that she contends often, perhaps even reliably, form between the participants, even those who come in with radically different, sometimes deeply opposed viewpoints. The hope that Landemore finds in these assemblies is that given this affection, even love for one another, participants come to understand themselves as having a shared aim of finding a solution that serves everyone, a truly common good. This conception of our political aim replaces that of winning power and control for our own faction. That, in turn, makes it not just possible, but attractive to search for truth. As I understand it, Landemore includes at least 3 different things under the heading of truth. First, ordinary empirical facts, such as might be provided by the expert advisors to the assembly, the sort of truth that even Arendt and Rawls allow in political conversation. Second, understanding the lived experiences of others. That is, what it is like to be a member of this society while also being unemployed or queer or Muslim or occupying any number of other standpoints, identities, or social locations. And finally, what should be done? What would amount to the best policy or way of addressing the issue at hand? I take it that it is the inclusion of this last category, though perhaps also the second, that leads to Landemore's cautions that truth may be plural. But importantly, Landemore holds that in order to make sense of political deliberation, as distinct from manipulation or coercion, we have to assume that there is some procedure-independent standard that defines better and worse ways of settling this practical political question. This seems to me to be an insightful point. I have enjoyed and benefited from contemplating Landemore's lecture, and I want to begin my response with an appreciation of her orientation towards hope and her commitment to offering us some concrete grounds on which to stake some hope. I agree that hope is essential, politically, socially, and individually, all the more so in this quite fearful and genuinely dangerous time. I have taken to warning my students that despair is a tool of authoritarians. Right-wing extremist movements such as we are seeing in the United States and around the world have historically faced a ceiling of about 30% on their popular support, not enough to prevail in elections, even those with the many built-in counter-majoritarian elements that we have in the United States. The pillars on which authoritarians build their power over majorities are fear and apathy. Hope, especially a vibrant, public, shared political culture of hope, is, I believe, the best antidote to both. We need to hope that things can be better than they are now, that we can make progress towards realizing our political ideals, and can address our historical failures to do so in ways that are honest and productive. Only if we have hope of such progress will we be able to make sense of dedicating our time and efforts to contributing to the project of doing so. In this way, hope, and for that matter despair, can be, at least to some extent, self-fulfilling. But only to some extent. There is a difference between hope and wishful thinking, and the former needs some rational grounding. In what shall we place our hope? Landemore's suggestion is that we place this hope in the capacity of members of a political community to love one another, even across various social and political divides. She brings inspiring, though it must be said anecdotal, evidence to bear to suggest that when thrust into small, face-to-face communities of joint deliberation, and as she clarified in Q&A, when given good food, citizens tend to come to see one another as comrades in a shared venture rather than as enemy competitors for limited resources or political power. Further, given time, they come to see one another as individuals. Iris Murdoch says that love is the extremely difficult realization that something other than oneself is real. I think that what Landemore describes having seen in these assemblies is the emergence of this realization. Participants replace the often threatening images and stereotypes that they had of their fellow citizens with appreciation of real people, individuals with concerns, fears, plans, and hopes just as genuine and intelligible as their own. In appreciating this reality, they come to love one another. Having arrived at this place of mutual love for one another, they no longer act defensively out of fear, but instead seek to construct a genuinely common good, some way forward that is good for all. This is certainly a hopeful and inspiring vision, and I hesitate to intervene in any way that might upset it. Landemore is certainly right that love for our interlocutors will, by undercutting an anxious defensiveness, tend to support a shared search for truth, and I would add justice. I suspect that she is also correct that such love is better supported by the shared deliberation that citizens' assemblies afford than by competitive elections, especially when the latter are subject to hostile actors and mired in disinformation. But it seems to me that Landemore goes further when she claims that such love is necessary for truth and justice. I think that the love in question may be quite difficult to achieve, and so I hope that it is possible to advance towards justice with something short of it. I think that my hope is also rationally grounded. In what follows, I will first explain why I hope that we can achieve justice without the interpersonal love for particular others that Landemore envisions. Then I will suggest that we nevertheless need to love or at least care about something in order to make just social life possible. In the last part of my comments, I will suggest some attitudes that we might have, attitudes that I think fall short of or are at any rate different from the interpersonal love that Landemore commends, but might still support a shared search for truth. First then, do we need to love our fellow citizens in order to achieve truth and justice in politics? Kant argues that a race of devils can join together in a just society, and this position is, in its own way, radically hopeful. Kant's point is that justice is solely a matter of how we treat one another in our external interactions. It is a matter of what we do, including what we do to, for, and with one another. And importantly, not a matter of what we love or what attitude we have towards one another. If each person were to act in a way that is consistent with the entitlements, rights, and freedoms of each other person, then justice would be achieved. It does not matter why each person acts in these ways. From the point of view of justice, it is all the same whether we act out of respect for one another's rights, love for one another, or merely a wish to avoid sanction. It is this latter possibility, the possibility that we can create external incentives for just behavior, that makes it possible for agents who lack care for each other, Kant's race of devils, to nevertheless establish justice. Our actions can respond to external incentives, such as the threat of sanction, and for the same reason, we can choose our actions. In fact, as I understand it, these come to the same thing. To say that I can choose to do something, that it is under my voluntary control, just is to say that I can do it for any reason that I take to bear on it. I can respect your rights to avoid sanction. I could also respect them to win a bet or to make you happy. Or I could respect your rights out of love. Any consideration at all that seems to me to count in favor of treating you with respect can serve as a reason on the basis of which I do so. By contrast, I cannot choose to love you, or in general, choose to have any particular attitude toward a person. Attitudes like love can't be undertaken for just any reason that makes it seem attractive to have them. I can't love a person in order to win a bet. I can't love a person in order to avoid sanction, and I can't love my fellow citizens in order to realize a just society. I can love someone only in response to an experience of them that calls forth this love. I hope that Kant is right and that love of the members of our political community is not necessary for justice, because I hope that justice is something that we can choose to enact if we care to do so. In fact, this seems to me to be an important desideratum for a political ideal. This will be true so long as justice requires only that we act in certain ways and not that we have certain attitudes towards each other. Now, as far as I can tell, Landemore does not disagree with me about the non-voluntary nature of love. She does not suggest that we could simply choose to love the fellow members of our political community, but rather that interacting with them in certain ways, something that we can choose, is likely to give rise to love. To love a person, I must have a certain sort of experience of him, And I cannot choose to have this sort of experience, but I can choose to put myself in the way of it. To return to the Murdochian formulation, I can expose myself to experiences that help me see the reality of others. Landemore suggests that citizens' assemblies are just such experiences, and that we collectively should integrate them into our politics for this reason. Now, I'm friendly to that as far as it goes. That is, I find plausible both that these sorts of interactions will tend to give rise to love, and that such love will tend to improve our politics. And I further agree that together these considerations constitute good reason to at least experiment with this approach to political questions. Still, I worry that if we needed to generate these sorts of interpersonal bonds among citizens, our prospects for advancing meaningfully towards justice would not be great. As a matter of human psychology, it could be true that we need such love for our fellow citizens to motivate an effective commitment to building a just society with them. I hope that it is not, because I think that this sort of interpersonal appreciation and bond is quite rare and limited. It is not, it seems to me, an attitude that we can have towards each of our fellow citizens or towards each of the members of our political community at large. That is, we need to build a just community with far more people than we can possibly love. Landemore briefly addresses related objections about generalizability and scale at the end of her lecture. One helpful thought that she offers in response is an appeal to moral or political imagination. I like the idea that citizens can come to see themselves as represented in and by the assemblies, interestingly in a way that they may not see themselves as represented by their elected representatives. Landemore suggests that further, by identifying with their members, we can also come to share vicariously in these members' love for one another. But it seems to me that there is a real and significant difference in kind between the interpersonal attitude that can form between individuals who have been in a room together, who have talked and laughed and maybe cried together, and this sort of vicarious bond. What I want to explore in what remains is the wider range of attitudes that might support a commitment to finding truth and a common good. Despite my concern that the political power of interpersonal love for individuals is limited, I share with Landemore the conviction that we need to love, or at least value, something if we are going to be motivated to advance towards justice. Above, I said that it seems to me to be an important criterion for a conception of justice, that achieving it is under our voluntary control. That is, we could choose to enact it if we cared to do so. But this raises the question, why should we care to do so? We can act for any reason that we take to bear positively on so acting, but what we take to be reasons for action will depend on what we value, care about, or love. I suggested that it is possible to have a just society so long as each person acts in accord with the rights of all, even if each acts this way only in order to avoid sanction. Even here, though, each would act for something that they care about, presumably their own well-being. Mere incentive to avoid punishment could support justice, at least if we met the high bar of getting these incentives set up correctly and effectively. But in reality, most of us need to care about something other than our own narrowly construed self-interest to make advance towards justice possible. And this is what makes Landemore's appeal to love one another so attractive. In a healthy, well-functioning family, each member may be motivated to make sure that each other member is treated justly out of love. But we do not need this kind of interpersonal love to be so motivated. We might not love, but only respect one another. We see one another as having reciprocal entitlements to make claims and to freely direct our activities in ways compatible with the freedom of all. This attitude towards one another is not the same as love, but it is a way of valuing others. And respect of this sort can also be a sufficient basis for justice. It might, for instance, serve as an ideal for a healthy and well-functioning academic department. But as Landemore recognizes in raising the issue of scale, political societies are far too large to rely on singular attitudes towards individuals. We are in relationships of justice or injustice with far more people than we know, far more than the number whose reality we could appreciate one by one, as we do in interpersonal love or respect. Arguably, we are in such relationships with all persons. If love or respect cannot motivate us in these instances, what does? I see at least three possibilities. The first is more cognitive than Landemore acknowledges, though I think that it is in fact still in the spirit of her approach. I offer it as a possible reinterpretation or further interpretation of her point about imagination. Once we have appreciated the sort of value that others have, we can think with the concept of their value. We can form and grasp thoughts like, all of the members of my political community have hopes and dreams and fears and plans that are as real and significant as my own. We can understand that the parents and children whom the Trump administration separated on our borders in 2017 have the same sort of bond, a love just as real as we have with our own children. We may need to love some individuals in order to grasp the moral concepts in play in these thoughts, and so achieve this kind of understanding. But once we have it, the thoughts themselves can move us, even if we do not love, because we do not even know the individuals most affected by the policies that we oppose and for which we advocate. Second, we can be moved not just by love of individuals, but by love of the community. Martin Luther King's concept of the beloved community can continue to serve as a powerful political concept. Love of a community, a church congregation, a school, even a family, is not the same as loving each of the individuals in it. It nevertheless has implications for how we are motivated to interact with these individuals, for what reasons we take ourselves to have. Love of a political community is, in my view, what really deserves the name patriotism. Patriotism, in this ideal sense, will motivate us to seek the common good. It will at the same time motivate us to care about what Marcia Barron and Taylor Rogers call the moral flourishing of our nation or community, to identify with and take responsibility for the actions of the nation, such that we feel pride when it acts well, and importantly, shame when it acts badly. Finally, we can love certain ideals of relationships. In particular, I would commend the liberal democratic ideal, in which no person or group dominates others. Each has a voice in the determination of our collective action, and each is free to direct their own lives. We can find this way of relating to one another compelling and be motivated to seek it out, independent of our attitudes towards the individuals with whom we do or can stand in such relationships. One finds appeal to this ideal even in Rawls. Landemore cites Rawls as an example of someone who attempts to base politics on rational self-interest. It is true that the parties behind the veil of ignorance reason about what principles to adopt, and further true that they are guided in this reasoning by concern for their own well-being, in particular a concern to raise the floor on their prospects in the society as high as possible. But what is our own relationship to the parties? It is obviously not a relation of identity. We live in front of the veil of ignorance, not behind it. Is that the end? I have one more paragraph. May I finish? Here we are. We're in front of the veil of ignorance. We live in front of the veil of ignorance, not behind it, well aware of our social identities and position. Why then should the conclusions that they reach matter to us and motivate us? Rawls's answer is that we will, or we should, find attractive the social ideal that his thought experiment represents, an ideal that he formulates in later work as living on terms that each person could reasonably accept. In sum, I am all for facilitating love between members of the political community, and especially for the difficult moral work of loving one another across differences and disagreements. I share Landamore's optimism that face-to-face interactions have the potential to overcome our fearful stereotypes of one another and generate bonds of love. I am interested in the possibilities that citizens' assemblies present, but I am also hopeful that we might succeed or at least make progress in other ways, by cultivating an attitude of respect for one another, by finding ways to apply the insight that we gain in loving individuals to claims and commitments about the value of those we have never encountered, and by constructing ideals of community that can attract the loyalty of a sufficient number of our fellow citizens. I want to end by proposing that we all get to work on this in whatever ways we can. Hope is essential, and time may be short. Thank you for your attention.
First, with apologies for the technical snafu. I think Professor Phillips is next.
Yes, I'd like to go next. And I want to begin by thanking the organizers of this year's Tanner Symposium for inviting me, and also thanking Elaine Landamore for her wonderful lecture, but also for your bravery in offering us hope, and also in insisting on the importance of the effective in political life. I think we're living through a period when many of the more hopeful ideas of the 20th century seem either willful self-deception or just lost causes. So the idea, for example, that democracies, however unsatisfactory as regards avenues for popular participation, nonetheless have some kind of ratchet effect, which means that at least they won't go backwards. Well, it's not really clear that that's any longer the case. Or the belief that the gross inequalities between rich and poor would be steadily eroded by progressive taxation, or just the hope that our children's lives will be materially better than our own. I think there are many reasons for a loss of hope, and it's been, I think it's been very good to have our thoughts turned to alternative evidence from our collective life that provides grounds for democratic hope. It's also, I think, very good to see affect made so central to the argument. Neither political theory nor political science has been much inclined to dwell on the affective aspects of human relations. Political science studies this, but even with the growing interest in psychology or the critique of simpler versions of rational choice theory, political scientists tend to see emotions and feelings as what the people they study might, perhaps unfortunately, be moved by, rather than anything that is of value in itself. Political theory, meanwhile, still tends to view affect as something that muddles the clarity and the reasonableness of an argument. So when Elaine Landamore insists so strongly that the flourishing of love between people is part of what activates the truth-building, she sees as both the goal and the outcome of democratic deliberation. And when she deliberately adopts the language of love, rather than its more civic correlates like empathy or solidarity, she makes a powerful stand against dominant views. So I'm less existentially hopeful, but I share what I take to be her belief that the current failings of democracy and equality are best met by raising our game, by raising our aspirations, rather than by retreating to the most minimal understandings and imagining that the very minimalism will somehow make them easier to defend. I too see citizens' assemblies as an important component of an enhanced and better democracy, and even more so indeed after the lecture yesterday, which helped me see much more clearly the difference between the elements that random selection brings to the practices of democracy as compared with the election of representatives and the self-selection of people in political mobilization. I also agree with her that the ways we relate to one another and the feelings that we have for one another are central to what it is to live and engage as democratic equals. I'm a bit more reluctant, however, to deploy the language of love, though for slightly different reasons than Kyla's. I want to stress commitments and claims in ways that Elaine, I'm going to call Elaine because I come from the UK, and if I call her Landemore, it just feels too much like, English public school practice. So, though I barely know you, I will call you Elaine. I want to stress commitments and claims in ways that Elaine may think edge too close to the partisan side of politics. And I argue that what she describes as an orientation towards truth-building could perhaps be better understood as an orientation towards equality. So I want to start with a comment on the interpretation of Hannah Arendt's essay on truth and politics. I was going to cut this bit because it's a bit of a quibble, but there were a couple of questions about Arendt after the lecture yesterday, so I decided I'd keep it in. So Arendt is as horrified as any of us about the abandonment of truth in much of contemporary politics. She sees facts and events as constituting what she calls the very texture of the political realm. She almost despairs of the modern manipulation of facts, the image-making, and the way unwelcome factual truths become redescribed as mere opinion. When she nonetheless writes that what she calls philosophical truth is, quote, unpolitical by nature, that those who take the perspective of this truth are taking a standpoint from outside the political realm, or that, again, quote, philosophical truth carries within itself an element of coercion. She's pointing, as I see it, to the unpolitical nature of truth claims that abstract from our lives as citizens and require neither discussion nor consent. So for example, the example that she gives that I find sort of clarifies this, she writes that when the all men are created equal of the American Declaration of Independence, when that's presented simply as self-evident truth, this makes it a pre-political fact. I mean, it's something justified by reference to what? It's justified by reference either to God or to nature in ways that she sees as having no political significance. It's only, in her argument, the addition of the performative, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that in her view turns it into something political, that is, into a political commitment by a body of citizens. And I think the contrast she's making there between a philosophical justification invoked from outside the political realm, truth with a capital T, and an understanding which is established through politics seems to me both correct and actually largely coherent with Elaine's own thinking. In fact, the more striking contrast, to my mind, is with, particularly in the light of the lecture that Elaine gave yesterday, is with Arendt's oddly affectless account of the democratic process. I mean, in her account of what she terms representative thinking, she describes herself as forming an opinion by considering a given issue from different viewpoints, this is a quote, by making present to her mind the standpoints of those who are absent. And she argues this doesn't mean blindly adopting the actual views of those who stand somewhere else, matter neither of empathy, she actually descants the idea of empathy, nor of counting heads, but of being and thinking in my own identity where I actually am not. The more people's standpoints, this is a quote again, I have present in my mind while I'm pondering a given issue, and the better I can imagine how I would feel and think if I were in their place, the stronger will be my capacity for representative thinking, and the more valid my final conclusions, my opinion. It's a kind of oddly solitary account of the politics that, is so dear to Arendt, and it seems to me that might be a better basis on which, to draw the contrast with what Elaine Landemore is offering us. It's a kind of dialogue almost within her own mind, not seemingly requiring the actual presence of others, and not aided by anything like empathy, which is very far from the account of the citizens' assemblies. It's also far from my own understanding of democracy, which I see as very much dependent on the the actual presence of others. But the point I just want to stress is that however weird it is as a depiction of the democratic process, it's clearly motivated. Her notion of what's going on here is clearly motivated by a search for better answers and more valid conclusions in ways that echo much of Elaine Landamore's own concerns. Anyway. It's just a quibble about Arendt. So my more substantive points relate to what democracy is about and for. I don't myself see it primarily as about truth-building, though obviously one hopes that will play a part in it. For me, democracy is primarily an expression of our commitment to equality, of the commitment we make or should make in forming democracies, to view all citizens as having an equal voice, and of the claim by those citizens that they too have a life to live and are in this of equal significance. I mean, this sounds highly idealistic as an account of how democracy came into existence, and that isn't at all how I mean it. I mean, to the contrary, I take democracy to be something reluctantly conceded by governments in the face of powerful mobilizations for the vote, and indeed typically spurred on by the need to offer something in exchange for military service. This last has been a recurrent theme in the work of historian Linda Colley, who argues that the expansion of the suffrage and the development of democratic institutions wasn't so much or wasn't just a response to successful popular mobilizations. Rather, she argues, it was when governments could no longer rely on mercenary armies and had to conscript soldiers from their own population that they began, however reluctantly and minimally, to offer some form of democratic equality, and tellingly, first to the men. In doing so, they established mechanisms and institutions designed to minimize the impact of the democratization and limit the scope for popular participation, and governments have been largely successful in this. Now, it seems to me that if one thinks of democracy in this way, one sees it as an unfulfilled promise of equality, unfulfilled both because of the powerful interests ranged against it, but also because of the sense of powerlessness that comes with the disempowerment and leaves too many of us simultaneously disenchanted with our leaders and unable to envision anything different. And I think one of the amazing features of the citizen assemblies, whose experiences Elaine Landamore has been tracking, is their re-empowerment of randomly selected citizens, a re-empowerment that people experience even when, as is mostly the case, the assemblies do not have final decision-making powers. They also experience, this of course being the central argument of yesterday's lecture, a sense of community, a bonding, sufficiently intense and personal to be dignified with the language of love. People come to value one another despite their differences and are drawn together in a joint search for better answers. Now, the depiction of this is enormously heartening, but I query the tendency to set it up in opposition to a partisan politics that continues to contest opposing interests. If democracy is, as I would argue, something achieved very much against the odds, disdained by those who wield the economic power, and barely tolerated by many who wield the political power, then it needs both advocacy and deliberation. It needs both protest and a caring search for common solutions to common problems. As Elaine notes, the Citizens' Convention on Climate only happened because of the months of Gilets jaunes protest against Macron's carbon tax, protests that involved mass demonstrations, street barricades, occupying airports, and some pretty violent street battles with the police. And the demands arising from these protests spread way beyond how to deal with the climate crisis, generating claims for major economic redistribution, wealth taxes, a higher minimum wage, higher pensions, and expressing deep resentment at the inequalities of French society. Unsurprisingly, Macron did not offer a citizens' assembly on policies for taxing the rich and improving the lot of the poor. Now, deliberation, at its best, enables people to arrive at better solutions to shared problems. I absolutely think that. But what about the many problems that are not yet conceived of as shared? In the long run, the rich may well have more fulfilling lives when they are no longer isolated from the rest of the world behind barriers of wealth, just as men may well be very much happier in themselves when they no longer oppress and undermine women. The problems of patriarchy and capitalism are, in that somewhat attenuated sense, shared problems, right, with outcomes that can leave all of us very much better off. But that's hardly how they are currently perceived. And in the meantime, politics will remain as much about competing interests as any search for common solutions to common problems. So for me, you know, the kind of, in a sense, it's the next stages after the kind of the wealth of hope that comes from the citizens' assemblies about how to think about how one has the other aspects of democracy that, to me, we cannot simply replace, we cannot do without. So I query not so much the depiction of what goes on in the citizens' assemblies, but a bit of a tendency to pit their deliberative processes against the supposedly antagonistic and winning-oriented character of partisan politics, as if one could substitute for the other, which, in my view, is not really the case. I also query, and I think this is more than semantic, though, you know, who knows. I also query the depiction of the assemblies as encouraging an orientation towards truth. I see what happens in these assemblies as described in Hélène's lecture last night as kind of better captured as encouraging an orientation towards equality. Deliberation enables people to see that their interests and their concerns are not the only ones at stake. And more deeply still, I think, it can enable them to recognize that their own understanding of the world and ideas about how best to regulate or change it have been profoundly shaped by their own partial experiences. Now, it's not just, I mean, why does recognizing that others think differently have this effect? Well, simply coming across other people's views need not of itself generate any change. I mean, too often it simply confirms us in the rightness of our own views and the wrongness of others. And nor is it enough, and this is part of the argument yesterday, to have an abstract devotion to truth and that kind of, you know, that anxiety that one might feel at the possibility that what one thought truth might not be such after all when confronted with opposing views. When disagreement helps us seriously reconsider our initial views, it is, I would argue, because we've come in a more substantial sense to recognize one another as equals. Now, with Hélène, I think this is as much an emotional shift as a philosophical one. Many people subscribe to the notion that we're all in some important sense of equal significance, but few of us actually live and feel that idea. Our equal right to vote, the foundation of electoral politics, commits us to the principle of equality, regardless of wealth, gender, race, religion, and so on. But it doesn't of itself do much to make this part of our orientation. One of the deliberative practices described in Hélène's account deepen this into a more substantial orientation towards equality, one where we take each other seriously, we listen carefully to views that we had previously dismissed as ignorant or ill-informed, and we try to come up with solutions that will work for all. And I thought one of the particularly striking observations in the lecture was that, you know, because people encountered one another without the prior labels of either social status or political views, you know, that they came together as kind of just randoms, that this was part of what enabled both friendships to blossom across normally significant difference and people to engage with those they might otherwise not talk to. This is a practice of democratic equality in which people come more substantially to see one another as equals and not just subscribe officially to that view. But to me, describing this practice of democratic equality, you know, in all its kind of wealth and kind of hope, describing it as an orientation towards truth, even in the small t truth manner, which is proposed by Hélène, doesn't, to my mind, capture its true force. So as I say, to me, I see it much more as what's going on there is developing this orientation towards equality. I also think, and this connects with some of the things that Kyla's been saying, though I have a different kind of worry. I also think that adopting the language of love to describe the bonds that are created in the process risks limiting the equality to only very specific political contexts. It seems to me it's surely part of the commitment to equality that you do not need to love people to see them and accept them as equals, that you do not need even to like them, that you may indeed have legitimate reasons to regard them as enemies. So if you think about the part of democracy that is expressed in human rights, the rights attached to human rights, including the right to a fair trial or the right not to be tortured, should not be taken away from people because they've behaved badly or because they've behaved in some way that makes them unlovable. And I think in similar fashion, the equality expressed in the more substantial forms of democracy argued for throughout Hélène Landemore's work should not be curtailed by expectations of us learning to love one another. The really challenging task of democratic equality, it seems to me, is to learn to see and relate to others as equals when you do not love them at all. Thank you.
I just want to say it's a great pleasure to be able to be channeling Don in this, and I will even include some of his characteristic snark. Warm thanks to Professor Landemore for her provocative lecture, brimming over with arguments and intriguing reports from the field. I agree with much in it. I share her long-standing commitment to the view that democratic debate and politics are crucially epistemic endeavors, that we are not simply or primarily in the business of preference aggregation or interest group pluralism and pressure games. I share her newer commitment to the view that it is a mistake to try to hive off the emotions from politics and from deliberation. And I am happy, no, actually gleeful, to see a political theorist grappling with actual social and political practices. So I could say perfectly honestly that I loved the lecture. But I can also say perfectly honestly that I didn't love it. I don't want to equivocate or to be coy or mischievous. I want rather to remind you that love can mean many different things. So I want to invite you to pause before you decide whether to embrace the thesis that love is a proper part of democratic deliberation and politics. Footnote. I will add parenthetically that I have just the same attitude about enshrining truth as central to democratic politics before we can imagine reviling it as a totalitarian effort to shut down the endless arguments and conflicts of democratic life, or embracing it as the whole point of deliberation or government by discussion. We have to ask what we mean by truth. Professor Landemore sometimes distinguishes capital T truth from a minimal or plural conception of truth, but alas, that contrast is more evocative than clear. I perked up some when she mentioned William James, since I'm a boring, unvarnished pragmatist. But my attitude about truth are, alas, closer to that of Richard Rorty. I just don't find the concept very interesting. Enough, I think, to say there are surely better and worse answers to questions about what we ought to do, and that we can and do give reasons, argue, criticize, and the like. I could get myself irritated by considering Habermas's forceless force of the better argument, but I'll spare you that. Here's Professor Landemore's most arresting formulation of her view. Quote, "We need more love in politics." Do we? Again, a lot will depend on quite what we do and don't mean by love. I'll recall a perplexing formulation in Martha Nussbaum's account. Quote, love is never well imagined as a constant experience. It is a relationship involving kaleidoscopically many feelings, actions, and reactions, including intense focus on the other person, but also including the solitary cultivation of one's own personal interests and even sleep. That's from Martha Nussbaum's Political Emotions, Why Love Matters for Justice. I am not inclined to think that concepts have to have necessary and sufficient criteria, or that dictionary definitions are all that helpful. Nor is my point that something has gone off the rails if one's account of love includes sleep. It's rather that we need to get reasonably clear on what sort of stuff we're including when we gesture towards love. So let me review some of Professor Landamore's claims. She tells us that empathy, sympathy, solidarity, and friendship are, quote, derivative forms of love, though she quickly adds that the emotions she witnessed in the citizens' assemblies were more intense. In a similar vein, she tells us that the yellow vests sought, quote, a human connection, end quote, tribal membership, and, quote, a form of civic bond. And love, and that love is a deeper form of the others. So suppose you think, sure, democratic citizens ought to have some kind of civic bond. Is that enough for you to subscribe to the thesis that democratic politics needs love? The closing plenary of the Convention on the End of Life, Professor Landamore says, was, quote, an unadulterated love fest, end quote. And again, that sounds awfully striking. But now consider some of the evidence she adduces for that claim. Quote, a young man cited French historian Ernest Renan's idea of the common heritage. A black man who flew back and forth from Guadeloupe for the sessions said he'd gained self-esteem and felt useful. I don't want to say, come on, that's not love. I want to say, well, if you construe love that broadly, it's easier to see it in political assemblies, in lots of other social settings too. But then too, the thesis that we need more love will have less bite. Most striking, perhaps, is how Professor Landamore glosses her clarion call, we need more love in our politics. She glosses it this way, quote, we need a place where people feel authorized to express and feel this kind of civic friendship, this kind of purely human connection to others, end quote. Civic friendship has an interesting conceptual and historical trajectory of its own. See especially Friendship and Trust as Moral Ideals, an Historical Approach, and Bernie Yack, The Problems of a Political Animal. Even a quick sketch would take me too far afield. But when you told your first crush that you were in love with them, and they responded that they just wanted to be friends, you didn't think they wanted a less intense form of love. You were suitably devastated. Worse yet, imagine they're saying, no, sorry, how about a human connection? So some of the time, Professor Landamore is construing love very broadly, but not always. Her appeal to an unadulterated love fest isn't a fleeting mistake or a throwaway gesture. The third meeting of the Convention for Climate, she reports, was, quote, like a successful third date. In one of the working groups, she continues, people addressed, quote, sweet nothings to Marie. I'm sure she thinks she observed citizens expressing ardent love for each other, not just the watery kind of love Aristotle dryly imagines as the best Plato could achieve by abolishing the traditional family. I have no reason to doubt her factual claim, but I do want to suggest some reasons to doubt its normative appeal. So back up. I've already said that I quite agree that deliberation is central to democratic politics and that it's a mistake to imagine deliberation as some purely cognitive endeavor where emotions could count only as distractions or distortions. So my worry is emphatically not that democratic deliberation needs to be walled off from the emotions. It's rather that I think Professor Landamore has the wrong emotions in play. Professor Landamore embraces love, in part as the opposite of hate. Nicolas Hulot, former Minister of the Interior, complains about the National Assembly, quote, "People hate each other over there." I have no reason to doubt or deny this claim. And she closes by suggesting that we might as well try pursuing love, quote, "since we seem to have reached the point of diminishing returns with the policy of hate." The politics of hate. I get it, or anyway I think I do, but I'm unpersuaded. I don't think we should aim for love. Not because love is unattainable, not because love won't scale up from these small citizen assemblies charged with hashing out policy, but because aiming for love would be aiming at the wrong direction. Consider a field report from this side of the Atlantic. At a campaign stop in New Hampshire last year, Donald Trump ran into Mickey Larson Olson, who had served 180 days for storming the Capitol on January 6th. She had no regrets about that. She thought everyone in Congress who voted to certify the results should be executed, and she wanted a front seat for Mike Pence's execution. Larson Olson's hair, a wig, was red, white, and blue. She was wearing a gaudy QAnon superhero outfit, and Trump came over and hugged and kissed her. Now, I don't know if he whispered sweet nothings in her ear, but she was ecstatic. Quote, "If I were to imagine what it would be like to hug Jesus Christ, not that I'm saying President Trump is Jesus Christ, but just, if I was to imagine what it was to be like to hug Jesus Christ, that's what it felt like for me," she said. Or think about the extravagantly emotional displays at Trump rallies. The attendees don't only love Trump. Are you tempted to copy edit here and replace Trump with something like their orange God? Please don't. They also love each other. But that solidarity brings us vanishingly close to Carl Schmitt's friend-enemy distinction, the one in which existential conflict up to and including death is what defines the political. These vignettes are at the least a reminder that love might work in politically pernicious ways, and I suspect Professor Landemore would be happy to agree with that much. She's interested in love across partisan lines, and this Trumpian love is very definitely an in-house, not to say incestuous affair. But I'd rather you think about your reaction to the vignettes. I'm going to go way out on a limb and suppose that there are way more lefties in this room than there are conservatives or Trump supporters. Or, if you'd rather, that way more of you marinate in MSNBC than have your eyes glued to Fox News. To continue along the same stale and stereotyped lines, do you hate Trump supporters? I don't think so. At its core, hate is an awfully hot emotion. Though yes, that concept too works in many different ways, as it is idiomatic to say, for instance, that you hate broccoli. But I don't think we should try to refine the sense in which lefties hate Trump supporters. Instead, I think that the typical lefty these days has scorn or contempt for Trump supporters. Contempt is cold. Maybe it comes with amused derision, but it doesn't make your heart pound as hate so often does, and as love does. In 2020, a woman got fired after telling some Black Lives Matter protesters, quote, "white lives are better." The video snippet of her saying that provoked this comment on Twitter. Quote, "Look at these mouth-breathing, ignorant, inbred, Trump-worshipping wastes of space," end quote. The guy who writes that can't be bothered to hate the woman who said it. He's casually dismissing her and inviting his readers to do the same. And Twitter being the cesspool that it is, some of his readers were happy to chime in. Quote, "They always look like that," wrote one. Quote, "8 chins and Walmart clothes." Quote, "Don't forget a bad hair bleach job," added another. There is a kind of nasty civic solidarity here. Some people are blithely assigning themselves the upper hand in what I suppose is finally a game of cultural capital, though cold, hard cash plays a role too. Bourdieu, not Du Bois, is the prophet of this lamentable politics. No wonder Trump supporters are not whispering sweet nothings in our ears, not joining us in an unadulterated love fest. But I don't think Trump supporters hate us overeducated, overpaid, coastal liberal types either. I think they resent our contempt, for sure. And I think they hold us in contempt. I could treat you to the bracing things a neighbor has said to me over the years, but I'd rather not. Again, contempt isn't hatred. Yes, we can attach different senses to contempt just as we can to hatred and to love. As plastic as both concepts are, hatred and contempt aren't remotely the same. You can hate broccoli, but barring special context, it would be weird to hold broccoli in contempt. Sure, too, you can hold people who eat broccoli in contempt. Whatever are they thinking? But barring special context, it would be weird to hate them. And contempt, not hatred, is poisoning our political lives. Likewise, love is not the opposite of contempt. The opposite of contempt is respect. Contempt is brushing someone aside, treating them as if they don't even register on your mattering map. You don't have to be a rabid Kantian to think of respect as acknowledging another as a person, someone with dignity, someone you can't treat only as a thing for your own use or abuse. Respect and contempt are in play in Professor Landimore's citizen meetings, too. Recall Omar's caustic response to an expert explaining a carbon tax. Stop treating us like children. He isn't complaining that the expert hates the citizens, nor is he demanding love or even affection. He doesn't want the expert talking down, condescending, scorning, holding in contempt. It's not just strategically idiotic to treat one's political opponents with contempt, though it usually is that. It also sets us off in the wrong direction. Respect is far better. It's probably more idiomatic to describe respect as an attitude than as an emotion, but I don't want to fuss over that. I'll just say it seems to me deeply liberal and deeply democratic to treat one's fellow citizens with respect, to recall that for all our deep disagreements, we are, after all, fellow citizens, and we should strive to work out reasonable terms on which we can live together. If something warmer comes in the wake of that initial stance, it's probably not any recognizable version of love. It's probably what the French revolutionaries called fraternité. Annoying gender dynamics aside, sign me up. So I wouldn't recommend that we try to replace hate with love. I'd recommend instead that we try to replace contempt with respect. I'll return finally to one last striking encounter from Professor Landimore's citizens' meetings. It's that between Finbar O'Brien, whose history of abuse had led him to conflate pedophilia and homosexuality, and extravagantly gay Chris Lyons. They bristle at one another, as well they might. But after debate, O'Brien rises to say, quote, he had no problem at all with the proposal for gay marriage, and the others gave him a standing ovation. O'Brien agrees that Lyons should have room to live his life, and the group doesn't hug or kiss him for his stance. They acknowledge his good performance. That applause isn't a sign of love on more or less any conception I can conjure up. It's a sign of approval, of respect, and that's precisely what we should be aiming for. Thank you.
Admirable impersonation. We will have about 20 minutes of response from Elena and then open up to our Q&A. The floor is yours.
All right, so first I want to thank everyone on this panel, Professor Eko Janka, and also my commentators, of course, Anne Phillips, Kyla Ebels-Dugan, and Don Herzog, aka Elizabeth Anderson. Did a wonderful impersonation. And of course the audience here for being here. It's again, I said that yesterday, but I want to reiterate that I feel incredibly honored to have been delivering this Tanner lecture, and in fact I'm still in disbelief about it to some extent. So let me try to do justice to those very rich comments. I just want first to remind the panel and the audience of the perhaps more limited approach and claim of the paper. I did venture some methodological comments yesterday on the kind of political theory I see myself as doing, and it's trying first to interpret what I observed correctly, faithfully, using some methods, observation, interviews that are borrowed from the sort of sister subfields in my field, comparative politics. And I think, and I maintain, that what I saw indeed was a form of love. So building on that, I'm trying to indeed generalize beyond that and move to a more normative position in terms of what I see as a desirable form of politics that I would hope to see at least inserted in the politics we currently practice, where there's not much of that. There's not much of a space for the kind of emotions that I observed, the kind of support and care and affection that I witnessed. It's interesting to me that I got almost zero pushback on the truth aspect, the epistemic aspect. I mean, Anne did push back a little, but not that much. I mean, in the end, it's about semantics, as you said. It's about, okay, do we call this truth, or maybe it's more like something about equality, or maybe it could be justice, but no one's really questioning the point of a procedure-independent standard of correctness postulated on the horizon of our deliberations. So it makes me feel like there's a disciplinary divide here that's really striking, because I'm in the political science department, and I felt like I had to spend so much energy just fighting for that claim initially. And just basically, if you really boil it down to the simplest message, it's really saying, look, politics is not just about power, it's not just about aggregation of interest. And that somehow was very, very hard to say in a political science department, which is itself very much influenced by economics, which has no room for anything like else than revealed preferences. And you see how, unfortunately, this kind of ideological presupposition that shape the field, they also translate into the political institutions we have, because I'm afraid that the politics we have is a lot more shaped by the political scientific premises than the philosophical ones. So I thought that was an interesting, striking fact for me to be on a panel where almost nobody took me on the more epistemological dimension of the thesis. I did get a lot more pushback on love, of course, so that's where I'm going to focus my remarks as well. But also I want to distinguish between what I saw, which I think it is what I saw, and maybe there's no moral significance to what I saw, but that's what I saw, love. And then the normative claim that we should have more of that in our politics. I also want to just react to the sort of comment by Kyla that, well, what you saw is also very anecdotal. So you're making a lot out of your 2 or maybe 3 case studies, which are the 2 French Citizens Conventions and the Irish Convention. So I want to push back just a little bit, because I do agree that it can look like, just a few cases, but your anecdote is my case study, and in qualitative, political science, we think it has, merit, and that you can infer some things from an in-depth study of even just one case study. That's not the preferred sort of approach. Usually, you triangulate using other methods like surveys or modeling or RCTs or other things, right? But a case study is not to be necessarily dismissed as just an anecdote. Also because, I'll just appeal to Hume here. David Hume used to say, well, you don't need to put your hand in the fire twice, one data point is enough. So he called it the induction of mature men, I believe. Well, I consider myself a mature woman, and I think there's something there that I actually think from other reports I've read, from case studies elsewhere, from for example, even I didn't bring that up so much, but the Icelandic the research I did on Iceland was, and I missed it initially. That's the irony, which is that I did all this research on Iceland and never asked once about emotions. And it's only later when I think I was asked to give a lecture on music and democracy or something like that. And I was starting to think about emotions. And I went back and I called back the chair of the Constitutional Council, and I said, do you remember any room for music? And they said, of course, we sang all the time. And we got into fights and we cried, and there were two solutions, alcohol and music. I was like, wow, I totally missed it the first time. So I think it's, so I would also mention, again, it's not studied, but for example, I haven't looked back, but juries, there's evidence that juries have a certain epistemic qualities. We now know with the DNA testing that they tend to track correct verdicts, actually, where the DNA evidence after the fact emerges. I don't think there's a study about emotions in juries. And it's a pity, but I think that should be done. I would also say that at this point, the OECD documents up to 800 cases of mini-publics that have been run around the world. So they're not all citizens' assemblies. In fact, typically they're much smaller. They're citizen juries, like 25 to 50 people. Many of them are not even counted. So if you add the hundreds of deliberative polls that Jim Fishkin from Stanford has run around the world, they're kind of like citizens' assemblies, frankly. It's just larger, and they don't necessarily come out with a policy recommendation, but you can measure their pre-deliberative preferences to their post-deliberative preferences. And again, anecdotally, but I think all of this converges, I know that Jim Fishkin told me that they did a recent one with Meta, actually, with 6,000 people, broken down into random groups talking to each other about AI regulation. And he said they wanted to stay in touch. They built a bond in just a few days, which surprises me because it's much shorter than typical citizens' assemblies, where they said, no, I've met such interesting people that I would have never met otherwise. I want to stay in touch. It's not love, definitely, but you can see that it's leading in the same direction of like caring and being interested and developing some kind of bond. So again, just to reiterate on the ease dimension of my lecture, I'm pretty confident that it is what I saw, and that this could be generalized to settings that are sufficiently similar. Now, on the art dimension, the claim that, well, maybe we should redesign institutions to foster the kind of love I saw, to improve the epistemic quality of our politics, to get to better outcomes, but also to, in the process of seeking that truth among that group of randomly selected people, reinforce or maybe create, actually, the bonds of community that are currently so brittle or even absent in some cases. But I admit that claim, I cannot believe I'm making it, because I think I've had for many years the exact position held by my critics, which is that, well, it's all about respect, it's all about equality, it's all about just this abstract commitment to justice and fairness. But I do want to say that experience of being immersed in the citizens' assemblies changed my view quite profoundly, because it changed me as well, I think. And so I don't know how much of that can be conveyed through a lecture, and of course you should be critical and skeptical. But I do think there's something really transformative about these spaces, and I didn't say enough about that. I don't know what to think of it either. Maybe it's a Stockholm syndrome, so it's not that desirable, actually. But it stays with me. It's not that having exited that space, I'm now gone back to my prior views. I have been sort of changed by that experience. But I just want to say that I totally understand the perspective, because that's how I used to feel about Mary Williamson. And so I'm hoping that I'm not becoming this crank who's putting out these views that are completely implausible. But I do think that, I hope, that's why I give so many examples and so many stories, because there's a point at which I feel like arguments might not even totally get you to the conclusions I've reached unless you go through the phenomenology of the experience in a way, which is really frustrating to admit for a philosopher, I would say. But this is where what I feel like I'm at the moment. So why not respect instead? So as I think I said yesterday in the lecture, there's this assumption that somehow it's so much easier to get respect than love. And it seems to me that actually pretty easy to grow love if you just really try a little bit. So maybe that assumption that respect is the lower hanging fruit turns out not to be correct. And also, I'm not sure that we have to choose in a way, because to me, the pair love versus hate and the pair contempt versus respect, kind of like orthogonal almost. Maybe they're related in some deep ways, but I just not sure that pursuing, trying to move us on one continuum moves you on the other, and maybe that's what Don is saying, that in fact you're taking the wrong direction. You're looking at the continuum of hate versus truth, and in fact you should focus on contempt versus respect. And so maybe I've been sort of blinded by the love, actually, that I saw, which is a much more visible sort of emotion, and I should have paid attention instead to something more subtle, which is respect in those assemblies. So I don't know what to think of that just yet. I'll take that comment with me and think about it more. But I just want to say that you can tell people, oh, you should respect others all you want. I'm not sure that's going to motivate them to do it. And sometimes I wonder whether respect is not, in fact, a byproduct of a number of transformation that you experience only when you start from love. And that's what I was saying. That's why I think Plato's intuition is so profound, in the sense that, well, actually, love is not the end; it's the beginning. That's where you start. That's a low-hanging fruit. You first love people, and then you abstract away from that very particular emotion that is oriented towards somebody very specific, and you refine that emotion into something more cognitive. I mean, I think love is partly cognitive, but you purify it more and more from the more emotional and immediate content, and you get to, perhaps at the end, respect. So maybe there is a continuum there, actually. So you move from a deep, profound emotion to more something like a disposition or an attitude of respect. And I don't know how else you would get to respect. I mean, you can try education. To me, it sounds very much like the classic liberal position that we're just going to educate the masses, and we're just going to send them to school and tell them about, we're going to impart knowledge about civic virtues, and somehow it's going to miraculously create a sense of respect and attachment to institutions. And I used to believe that, and I just don't, I'm not convinced anymore. I think you need to mobilize something more effective and first. Additionally, I would say that one thing that I didn't talk about much, but I think, because I just thought of it when somebody asked a question, I think, yesterday, but I think it's present in the stories I tell, that it's not clear to me that people can identify as equals and have respect for others if they don't see themselves as equals and have respect for themselves. And I wonder if they can have that kind of respect for themselves if they don't love themselves. So it's also about that. So it's also about self-love. And I think back to the example of Jules, the climate skeptic who was always felt sort of alienated from politics and obviously rejected somehow, or probably unloved. And then he comes to this convention, and within a couple of weeks he says, I feel loved. And I think it means I also, well, that's the thing. What does it really mean? My interpretation is that he's recovered a sense of self-love also, that allows him to access things like dignity and self-respect, and in turn helps him develop an attitude of respect for others. So I think all of this is connected in a way that I do not articulate clearly, I admit, but I think it's there. And probably that's what I would like to do next, which is to unfold all these connections more clearly. Now, Don also takes issue, I think he's mostly the one who's really pointing out the broadness of my concept of love. So I'm all for analytical clarity and drawing distinctions and making sure we don't confuse one emotion for another. At the same time, actually, Not sure what's accomplished by separating so much friendship, say, from love. So when you love a friend, when you have a friendship for a friend, there's not really a word we can say, I like you, it's true. So which is why I think that when Francois tells to Omar, I love you, it's a little startling. But broadly construed, love as an intense affection, I think includes certain types of friendship at least. And so I don't have the sort of worry that Don seems to have about trying to make the concept particularly, precise or something like that. So anyway, so I wouldn't partition those terms as much as he does. But that said, even assuming that we can have this big umbrella concept, does that mean we want more of it? Don seems worried about love as too demanding, so that goes back to this idea that love is the pinnacle of what we can accomplish in politics, when in fact I'm trying to say, well, actually, it's a low-hanging fruit, and maybe we should go there. He's worried that it won't last as well, which I'm tempted to say, well, maybe it won't last, and so what? In a way, it's there to accomplish a purpose, and maybe whatever is left of it, even if it's a more sublimated notion of attachment to the institutions that produce that experience, it's already something. We all have friendships that, and loves that disappear, and still we feel like it was worth living them, and it sort of changed us, and hopefully for the better. Then he points out that, well, love is present in mobs and groups of Trump voters. So maybe what I should say more precisely is that it's not that we just need more love in our politics, it's that we need more love that is properly channeled, right? Because I think, in fact, I should preface the talk by saying that it's a little bit about institutional design, right? Not saying that there's no love completely. I mean, there are, it's like weed, it grows anyway. But you want it to grow in a healthy way, in a way that you can channel for the purpose of, figuring out better policies and laws, and for the purpose of fostering the right kind of relationships between people. So I don't think the love between Trump voters is bad. It's just that it won't have these epistemic properties because it's growing between people who think alike and are not willing to expose each other or think of alternative views or seek out alternative views. So my view is that it should be redirected. We need to take the love where we can find it, cultivate it, and redirect it. Now, can it scale through imagination? So that's a claim I make very briefly at the end, and I'm glad Kyla thinks it's possible. I do think it's possible. Is it still love by the end of the stretching process, if you will? Well, I think there are still some molecules, yes, that survive the sort of stretching. And it makes me, it takes me back to this feeling I had myself. I've left my country for over 20 years now. And I never missed it. I never felt anything like what people talked about, like nationalism, patriotism. The first time I felt like that was when I went back to that third session of the convention, and I saw the flag, and I felt that emotion for the first time. And I think it's because it felt like this was an object worthy of my love, and like pretty much the sort of politics as usual that I was familiar with. So, oh my goodness, I have so many things to say. Would you give me 3 more minutes, because I feel like I only addressed okay. So is it necessary? So that's a big claim, and I confess that I'm not entirely sure. I'll just say that I think it's necessary in the context of these assemblies. I don't think the people would sustain the intellectual effort, the attention over many months like this without a passionate sort of commitment that is fueled by love. So does that mean we need it outside of the CAs? Again, depends on definitions. If you think that the sublimated form of love, civic friendship is enough, then is love, then yes. I would also say it depends on the context, because we talk here in a perfectly peaceful context. Maybe we don't need love, maybe we can get by with respect. But I think if you're in Ukraine right now, or if you're in war context, maybe you do need an intense form of love and attachment to your fellow citizens and your country in order to do the right thing for your country. Otherwise, you're just going to leave and go back to another safe place where you can afford to be just focused on your individual pursuits and never make any kind of sacrifices. So I think right now it's comfortable for us to talk about how respect and self-interest and these other notions are enough. I think it depends a little bit on external context. So Anne pushed me on equality. I would say that it's not that I don't care about equality, obviously I care, it's just that I take it as a premise of the whole exercise. I'm not really talking about the point of love in an oligarchy, or I'm really focused on the democratic context where equality is baked in the design choices before we even come in, with our citizens' assemblies. And of course it's formal and not substantive, so there's a lot of things that you need to do. But I think that that wouldn't be enough. Even if we treated everyone absolutely equally in these settings and we try to model the kind of respect and value that each citizen has, I don't know that it would get us the epistemic properties. I don't think it's enough, again, in the context of the citizens' assemblies, to get the outcomes that I saw and that I think are desirable. On the question of, aren't you too harsh towards electoral politics, partisan politics, agonistic politics? Yes, I admit I am, because I'm very disillusioned on that front, and it's very hard for me to find affection or remobilize myself for this. And also because, again, I'm in the political science department where I feel like 95% of what my colleagues do is about propping up that model and telling me how it's the best invention since sliced, whatever the comparison point is, but it's just... So I feel like that's where I come from, this defense of electoral partisan politics is already overwhelmingly represented in my environment, so I'm trying to push a little bit against that. Okay, I think so I do sometimes go close to, come close to saying that I don't see a problem with replacing elected assemblies with citizens' assemblies, truly empowered citizen parliaments. There's a very good book by John Gastill and late Eric Olin Wright called Legislature by Lot, where you have a series of people defending the sort of pure autocratic scenario versus the hybrid scenario defended by Olin Wright and Gastill. And I have to say, reading the responses, I find myself more convinced by the people defending the pure model, because in a way, and also from what I saw, the elected assemblies will tend to fight back, tend to try to minoritize and delegitimize citizens' assemblies. They're afraid of the competition. And I just don't know, if you have a program that's defended by an elected assembly versus the program put forward by a citizens' assembly, like the legitimacy competition is really hard to solve, and I worry that it will just lead to gridlock. So in my view, in my open democracy model, the citizens' assembly, whatever the legislature by lot, is central to the model, has legislative supremacy. And then if you want parties, they will emerge anyway, and they will help structure debates around referenda and things like that. But do you need another chamber, we can, there are many, many institutional scenarios, but it's true that I do not have great sympathy for electoral politics. So I'll stop there.
Excuse me. So I want to thank everybody for this conversation. I don't know if we've put, oh yeah, there are microphones in the corner. I'm going to take a moderator's prerogative, not for myself for once, but because you were so generous to join us in Don's voice, you can defer if you want, but I want to give you an opportunity if you wanted to ask questions in your own voice, and then we'll turn to the Q&A. Don't feel, I should have warned you I was going to do
Oh,
something.
no, actually, I do have a question. I wonder whether many of the observations of people connecting emotionally to each other would be better understood in terms of Adam Smith's sympathy. That is, you have people who are not always talking in argumentative mode, reasoning from abstract premises, moral premises. Rather, they're telling stories about their own experience and how that mattered to them. And when people do that, they're inviting other people to stand in their shoes and imaginatively represent to themselves or simulate to themselves what it would be like to be that person, as a way to come to an understanding of why they stand in they're taking a particular political stand. And that sympathy is emotionally very powerful once people engage in it. And it can also be, I mean, as Smith affirmed, people have a desperate need for that kind of empathy, for the affirmation of one's own emotional responses to experience. And that seems to me, I don't think, it's not quite love, but I think it can carry most of the cases, and it's very powerful. The other thing I wanted to say is, I do want to affirm the connection between affect and normative truth, in the following sense, that we need a mechanism for people who are wrapped up in a certain, say, ideology or dogmatic set of principles. How can you ever get out of that? And argumentation in the abstract sense often doesn't work because they have a self-enclosed set of premises, and anything that doesn't fit, they'll just reject out of hand. Well, how? But we do know that people change. They can actually get out of being locked into some rigid framework. And I think what does it is what I've called moral apprehension, which is a vehicle that we get from connecting in a real way to emotions, like sympathy. Because there are natural objects of sympathy, and frankly also of respect. And that can kind of break through the dogmatism of just rigid views that exclude and deny other people's humanity.
So, can you hear me? Yeah. That's a very good point. Truth and Sympathy would have made for a less good title. But I also think, I still think, I don't know, again, maybe it depends on how we define terms, but sympathy it's feeling with, in fact, suffering with. And there was a lot of that, definitely. A lot of, tears shed on behalf of people who had lost I mean, I can't tell you the number of times that people shared things in plenaries, and you looked around, everybody had tears in their eyes from the difficult stories of losing somebody to cancer and not having the means to alleviate their pain, all of that. So there was an enormous amount of sympathy. But I also think that there was an enormous amount of love, which wasn't suffering with, which was just like again, like François said to Omar, I admired you, I was grateful for your interventions on our behalf, and I just fell in love with you. Not because I felt with you, I didn't even know you at that point, So the point I'm taking, though, is that, okay, maybe that's true, you had both love and sympathy, but the normatively attractive feeling is actually sympathy. And that, I don't know what to say at this point, I need to think about this.
Professor Cornell.
Hi. I really enjoyed all of this, like the talk this morning and then the talk yesterday and the comments this morning. It's been a wonderful conversation. I wanted to ask about what I sort of feel like are two different aspects of love that are kind of go back and forth in what I've heard. So one picture, when I first heard the sort of thesis, I thought this was an idea where love is going to involve valuing or apprehending the other in a way that can sort of overcome identity differences, which is sort of somewhat familiar, but then the way you play it out is very, very nice. And it's going to work very well for things like the assisted dying, where you've got people with one set of experiences and a different worldview coming in conflict, talking. And I had the worry, though, that other kinds of questions are not going to be as amenable to that sort of thing. There's a different, and it's also going to run into, I think, some of the problems that like Kyla and Don were raising about, like, why not just say respect them? A different picture, so there's this kind of cliche quote, but I'll give some for French. Saint-Exupéry says, right, love doesn't consist in gazing into each other's eyes. It involves looking outward at the world in the same direction. So a kind of different picture, aspect of love that I think maybe is what you're picking up on is not that we're valuing the other, and that's the basis for the political, but we're valuing something in the world because of our relation with some others, right? And part of this is of interest to me because I'm interested in the environmental aspect, and it's striking to me that your primary example here is about climate, and but you didn't say much about the environment. So you might think, right, what we need to address climate is partly like love for nature, love for the natural world, right? And you might think if what you're picking up on is love as apprehending the value, you might think what we need for that is not a citizens' assembly, but like to get people out, like communing with the trees, right? But I take it you think love is doing something for the environment in these contexts, and I could see how that would work. But it would be this sort of through our love for one another, we're apprehending a value out there. And so I guess I wanted to invite you to say something about like what happens about the environment in these, where's the environment here, and maybe also like, is the love about appreciating the other person, individual, with the sort of more liberal, traditional liberal kind of thing, or is it this like, through them, I'm seeing some value in the world? Yeah.
It's a fantastic question, actually. So there's one passage where I could have talked about climate and didn't, and it's a footnote now. You remember when I mentioned Muriel talking about and I changed the name, so I can't remember. Sometimes I mix up the original name and so Muriel looks in the plenary session for the youngest member of the Citizens' Assembly. I called him Thomas in this context, and she says, "I hope your hair turned a lovely gray," and I think there was clearly a sense in this convention throughout that they were also trying to proto-legislate for the future, for the unborn, out of love for the unborn. So it was not out of love for the environment per se, or animals, or the trees, but, And you said something, it's going to make me sound even more of a crank or a crazy person, but I do think that, like going out and going in nature and maybe having the citizens' assemblies in a non-urban environment would have actually been very smart. And that, because the implications of not just that, but the general views I have about open democracy and all that, it's also like changing urban planning, changing the architecture of our institutions, and maybe placing them elsewhere. Right now, they're always in urban centers. They're always, it creates a sense that the center of the world is made of concrete and palaces and grand buildings, and that might be a big mistake. And so recently in class with my students, I told them, okay, if you could design your ideal parliament after reading everything we've read, what would it look like? And some of them said, oh, we would place this in a big park with a zoo and a farm. And I was like, why not? Why does it have to be a big building? masculine looking with people in suits, and why can't it be completely different? And reintegrating a sense that we're part of nature, part of the rest of the world, I think that that's also very much something that I would like to see.
So I'm going to recommend that everyone who asks a question introduce themselves, because it's only fair that Hélène know who we are. And of course, we know each other. I'm Lisa Dish, and I teach political theory here. I loved your talk in the way that you described how you were changed by those experiences. And it's interesting that you returned to that this morning and talk about how maybe one needs to see this and be transformed by it in order to take seriously what goes on in these citizens' assemblies. And I'm totally willing to grant that. And yet I want to pick up on what Ann Phillips said, pressed you on, pitting the citizens' assembly against traditional elections and politics. And what I'm thinking about, your talk has made me think about a lot of things that I will continue to ponder, but I still am committed to the idea of running for and winning elections. And the reason I'm committed to that kind of politics is because it gives you access to resources. And those resources are budgets and staff expertise. Those resources help you answer that question, what should we do, both at a very high level, which is often the level of the deliberative assembly, but it's not necessarily only that, but that's the high level where we define our principled commitments. So we say, yes, we believe in climate action and we believe in affordability, but it also gives you the ability to answer that question in these boringly specific ways that have immediate consequences for people who have never met you, who have never met each other. So when you win an election, you get to make choices about policy options and investments that change people's modes of transport or the housing options that they have. And I wonder how the civic transformation you talked about witnessing translated into change. And I know that Paris has actually changed quite a lot. And so maybe the Citizens' Assembly did that, did the participants in the assembly have direct efficacy around those changes? Was it really mostly an interpersonal transformation, or do they remain politically active? Do they remain reaching for levers of power as well?
Question as well. I'm not going to try to defend my almost temperamental rejection or distrust of electoral politics. I think you're probably right that you need both. You need agonistic politics combined. I don't know how. That's a big mystery. With more, common good-oriented politics. But I would say, though, that I'm surprised that you assume that resources and budget and staff can only be available to decision makers through electoral politics. In the citizens' assemblies, there were experts made available to the citizens. Ideally, in a sort of utopian scenario, these assemblies would be institutionalized as permanent bodies with their own staff, their own experts, or their own access to experts, or all kinds of resources, and a constitutionally sort of entrenched power to have efficacy and either legislate or make mandatory recommendations of some kind, or maybe they would go to referendum immediately. So I don't know that efficacy needs to be tied to elections. You could say, well, yes, but in a democracy we want to be the agents of change. I just had this conversation with Richard Tuck recently. So he thinks that democracy is all about agency, and that's why we need elections, and that's why randomly selected assemblies are a sort of epistocratic substitute for actual power of the demos. And my answer is always that, well, yes, but right now in the current system, you delegate the task of setting the agenda, of formulating the proposals and the solutions to a select few that do not look like us, do not think like us, and yes, are somewhat tied to us through this, through the electoral process that supposedly ensures, responsiveness and accountability. I think there's enough empirical evidence that it's a tenuous form of accountability and a tenuous form of responsiveness, actually, so that we could at least consider transferring the agenda-setting part of the process, the legislative part of the process to an assembly that actually looks like us, so we get answers that are closer to the truth, what we need, because people think like us, have gone through similar experiences and everything. And if we want to retain the agency, which I also value, I mean, of course, we should have agency, at the collective level, then those should be organized and manifested in moments of mass referenda. So, I mean, it's a much bigger conversation than this paper really engages in, but yes, I would be for a kind of politics that involves the masses, that mobilizes them around visions of the world and big picture ideas through referenda rather than through elections.
Hi, my name is Ariana. I'm a graduate student.
Soon to be newly minted professor, Peruzzi. Congratulations.
Thanks. This is a friendly question. I'm sort of wondering if this is partly a story about what political emotion is most appropriate for the particular context of making policy decisions as democratic decision makers, because it seems like your story is also compatible with the idea that there are times when the appropriate political emotion might be anger or contempt. I mean, I think in some ways, like, this is responding to maybe Dawn's comments, but almost on your behalf, which is that it doesn't seem like your story is incompatible with the idea that we can go back out on the street and sometimes feel justified anger and it be an important kind of political emotion. But when we're making policy decisions, that's not what we want to be feeling. We want it to be love, and maybe even particularly mutual love. If Chris had continued to love Finbar, even while Finbar continued to want to throw him out a window, that might be pathological. Like, it seems like also another important part of the story is that it's not just love, but like institutional design that allows for mutual.
That mutual love, not just love. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That's helpful. And I haven't thought about this very much, about the value of other emotions like anger and contempt. You could say Omar's outbursts of anger were actually justified in many cases. He was pushing back against experts trying to constrain and limit the options on the table for citizens, or trying to steer their conclusions. And he was like, no, we are in charge here. You are at our service, putting back the experts in their place. And sometimes that takes anger. I'm sure it would have been nicer if you had put it more politely, but the impulse behind the emotion was probably correct. Resisting capture, resisting encroachments on their sovereignty, you might say. And there's a political theorist named Jeff Green who's written a book where he defends the view that it's actually correct to feel envy and resentment in the contemporary plutocratic politics we're in. So he's kind of like I guess a populist, defending the populist anger at elites I'm not sure I want to go there, but I do think that, again, it's about how you channel those emotions, right? And the Yellow Vest also had a sort of an understandable resentment and anger at the carbon tax and the system more generally behind it. So anyway, I just want to say that I agree with the comment behind the question. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, so much. My name is Margot Witt. I'm a grad student in philosophy here. I found the conversation about love versus respect versus sympathy really helpful. I think that this question works whether we put that emotion in terms of love or sympathy or respect. And like credit where this is due. This is inspired by reading some of Professor Yanka's work, so thank you. I've been wondering whether that's a relationship of love or respect or sympathy, how that gets off the ground, given these, I'm standing on tiptoe, but I probably don't need to do that, given these really deep-set inequalities that we have. So in the example of Philbar and Chris, one of them is in a much more vulnerable position to start loving the other one. Love and, oh, sorry, I will sit on tiptoe. Especially if we do it in terms of, they don't teach us how to adjust microphones in our PhD program here. So loving someone makes us really vulnerable to them. Chris and Philbar can't exactly like make this agreement and say, okay, I'm gonna start loving you if you start loving me on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3, go. One of them has to make themselves vulnerable first. And I'm wondering if part of your theory is that there's this special obligation on sort of the privilege to open up the doors to love first. How do we do that without just like putting ourselves in danger all the time?
No, that's what's so frustrating about this beautiful story of Finbar and Chris is that the journalists focus on the departure and the end point and didn't really tell us. I mean, I don't have the account. I don't think anybody documented that, of how they got there. So it's sort of assumed that it's obvious that by working together every day, at some point maybe they ran into an issue, they disagreed, and then Chris made a good, I have no idea, I have to reconstruct this. And again, it's not documented, which, by the way, if people are looking for dissertation topics, I mean, maybe it would be more appropriate in the political science department, but I think we need more research on that, the emotional aspect, the friendship developments, because we don't know. I do think it's going to be through micro adjustments rather than big exposures to vulnerability. Like it's too risky. People won't do that. They're very guarded and they open up slowly, and only when they sense that the other person is adjusting accordingly to their own, revelations or so. I think it was the case in the Convention on End of Life where people were very cautious about divulging that their opposition to euthanasia, say, was religiously motivated. So, I didn't document that, so I don't know. But and they were sounding each other out and figuring out where they were. Maybe there's also a way to encourage this kind of this through institutional design, and I feel like, for example, I mentioned yesterday as something we never tried, but I think would be worth trying, assigning roles at random, so that people would be encouraged to think in the shoes with sympathy of the other position, and maybe in that position they could say, oh, I never thought of that, and then it would bring people together in a non-endangering way, I would say. I'm also thinking of, this is going to sound, I'm really going in a direction that I cannot believe I'm going, but, Christianism there's this fundamental core, and I'm not a religious person, by the way, I guess I'm an atheist. But this idea that you turn the other cheek and you break the cycle of violence, the tit for tat sort of, and tit for tat is actually quite good. It's already an improvement on the feudal sort of revenge cycles from before. But somebody harms you and you refrain from harming them back. It's an enormous display of vulnerability. It's very risky. At the same time, I wonder whether you can exit a cycle of hatred without doing that. And it takes enormous courage, and it takes leadership, and it takes... I'm not saying that this is what we should expect from citizens. I'm saying it's super derogatory, it's too much. But in a large group of random people, there might be someone who will take that chance, who will take that risk, in a way, you could say Finbar did. I mean, you know, it can't have been easy to stand up at the end and say those things. And I think it unlocked something beautiful and perhaps freed other people from inhibitions and let them vote the same way for the same outcome, even if they were also encumbered by all sorts of prejudices. So you know, that's what I have to say about this at this point. But a brilliant question, thank you.
So then, if I may, so I want to join everybody in thanking you for this. You said you didn't get enough pushback on truth, so I wanted to pick up on that a little bit. Not so much pushback. I mean, I actually have spent some time thinking about civic obligation, duty, and fealty. So I tend to share a kind of affection for, but the deflated or less demanding kind of things that have been on offer for you. But I actually think that when I read your definition of truth, it wasn't so much that love made truth necessary, so much as your definition of truth is what made love necessary. I know that sounds quippish, but let me explain a little bit what I mean. So when we take the Kantian view that even a society of devils could be moral in some sense, I think that might be true for some set of politics, right? For some set of respecting your rights, coming to agreement on obligations, what's prohibited versus permissive or obligatory. Maybe it's true. I'm not even sure that's true. After all, they're deep and important controversies about new rights and obligations, which are going to take something more than simple rational coherence. But even if I were to be so fully Kantian that I thought one could reason their way through that, we might notice that on your view, that describes only one section of the truth. Because one of the things you speak about in truth is not just facts that are hugely important, not just societal conclusions, but a kind of truth about how we should reason together, what we should view, what society we want to build, what's good, the phrase you use is what's good for us around here. And notice that a lot of politics is about that. I mean, I'm not at all denying the hugely important part of politics that's about whether or not one has a right to an abortion or whether or not one should get social security checks. But there's also a huge amount of politics that's about what kind of society do we want to build, when it's very clear that there are no obligations on one way or the other, right? That there are many different ways in which we can build. What kind of nation do we want to be in the world, and on and on and on. And in those moments, it seems to me that there's something really attractive about what you say. In order to reason just past my preferences, or in order to give to my political adversaries more than I owe them, I was struck by your moment where the minority in the convention was so grateful that they had 50% of the share of the document, right? That's not rational. That's not about a kind of Kantian respect of devils. That's about a true generosity, a kind of view, I could win this moment against my adversaries, but let me grant them more than they are needed. Or, you know, my political movement is sweeping the day, but let me make space for my adversaries in ways that are not just rationally respecting, but about some true feeling of affection, or we must live together around here. Let me make place for these people. I don't have to win the day. And I think focusing on that feature of your version of truth makes the claim that something like true caring for your fellow citizens is necessary. Now, some people are going to push back and say that's an awfully expansive version of truth. And I leave that for you to defend. But it certainly recognizes that a lot of politics is not just about rights and permissions. It's really about creating a world together. And that does seem to me to require some version of wanting to care together with your fellow citizens.
So I agree, and I want to respond to the point about generosity with an example, actually, from the conventional end of life. So at one point, the governance committee, we wanted to choose two representatives of the convention to go and talk to journalists, I believe. And usually when we had to choose people, we did it randomly. So there was a moment at the very end where we actually didn't know what to do because we needed to choose representatives to talk to the nation through a broadcast and representatives to talk to President Macron to deliver the report. And we felt like, well, maybe randomness is actually not appropriate, so maybe we should let them decide. And then they asked us, well, we want to have a debate, and they talked, and to talk to Macron, they decided to go random. To talk to the nation, they did something called candidate-less elections, where they themselves picked the candidates, if you will, like they chose the bees in the group, the hardworking sort of studious sort of types. But anyway, when you chose the people to talk to the journalists, as chance had it, it was two anti-assisted dying people who were chosen. So there was a floating moment. We're like, oops, what are we going to do? And they said that. They said, well, we can't accept because we need at least one of us to be on the pro side, otherwise we... And they all said, everybody spoke up, and not everybody, but many people spoke up and said, no, we trust you. We know you can speak on behalf of the larger group and put your own preferences on the side. I thought that was a moment of trust and in a way generosity, because it's a risk. So just to illustrate that, there was a lot of that as well. And in fact, listening to you, it made me feel, since we're talking about love, maybe I should also use the metaphor of marriage, right? Because in a marriage that works well, I don't know who said that, but it sounds very convincing to me, you should always feel like you're doing 60% of the work, right? And I think that's what they felt like. Like the majority felt like, well, we're really giving in to the minority, probably too much. I mean, we're close to 80%. Why do they take 50% of the speaking time? Why do they take? But they gave that. And conversely, well, in that case, the minority, was happy to be given more time. But because they were given more time, they were willing to represent the group and set aside their own convictions. And by the end, they gave back because 74% of the group voted for the final report, even though there was a really strong minority against a good chunk of the content. So it's like this idea that you need to, even if you think you're doing more and you're being generous, and I think it's hard to do that without the motivating force of love, or at least sympathy.
Lastly, I should have added, one sees this in very clear ways when the dominant group has to make space for minorities when they don't have to, but so too, I mean, we were speaking about this over dinner last night, so too, the very heartbeat, for example, of King's writing, which was of course religiously inflected, was about how minorities have to love even when they're totally rational in not doing so, right? I mean, the idea that you will literally march into the teeth of dogs to make this nation better, not just for your benefit, but to make your white friends better, to make your white fellow citizens better. It's just a way of my saying, even as to you're right, the way we're all trained to be deflationary, I really was touched by a moment where you see so much of politics isn't just about this immediate bubble of rights, but about imagining a world together beyond that. And that does take a kind of affectation, which I think is missing from our ordinary tools. So I really appreciated that.
Yeah, could I just sort of come in with an observation, because it seems to me quite striking that we, it's as though we search through a whole range of terms and concepts like love, trust, respect, sympathy, to find a way of capturing what it is either we see occasionally or we would like to see more of in the ways in which we engage with one another within democracies. And I'm so struck by how rarely people use what to me is the key term in all this, which is equality, which is what it is to engage with one another as democratic equals. And I think my sort of hypothesis is that there are two things going on there. One is a kind of very mistaken assumption that we're already there in terms of the basic principle of equality, as if that's a premise of us even being here. So it doesn't tell us anything, doesn't add anything. And the second is almost like the other extreme of that, which is that equality has these associations of enormous social and economic transformations that are a kind of condition for us relating to one another as equals, which then seems like, yeah, if you've got to have that in order to engage as democratic equals, then where do we go? So I think somehow between those two, people seem to shy away from what to me is the term that captures precisely this sense of what it is to actually experience other people as equals, right? Take them seriously as equals. Engage with them as equals. And I think there are particular practices and institutions which encourage that. I mean, I do myself think that, you know, huge social and economic transformation is ultimately a condition as well. But I think that there are ways in which disempowerment makes it very difficult for people to see others as equals. I mean, I thought your point that you picked up about self-love is important, that if you're disempowered, if you're systematically disempowered, you may lose the ability to love yourself. And I think when you don't love yourself, it's very hard to relate to others as equals. So I think actually that, so there's over-empowerment, there's disempowerment, all of these things make it very difficult for us to engage as equals. But it seems to me that part of what's going on in the citizens' assemblies is a particular kind of institutional practices which enable people to actually embody equality in a much more real, substantial way. And, you know, you can, to me, you can call it love, respect, trust, sympathy. I wonder why we shy away from calling it equality.
Well, go ahead.
I'd like to respond directly to your point, because in the theory of moral sentiments, Smith actually does draw that connection, but he's very concerned that our sort of, many of our sympathetic reactions are deeply, deeply biased by vanity, basically. And so that's why he thinks we have to get a little bit of critical distance on our immediate affective response. And he thinks the device of an impartial observer, like, how would an impartial observer, would that person sympathize with what I'm feeling right now? And he thinks that if you actually take up that perspective, you will realize that you are no better than anyone else, right? That's equality pops out.
I want to add something. So equality is not an emotion, right? So it's hard for me to put it in relation to these other emotions, to these emotions. But that said, and it's true, I answer to you, well, I take equality as like the background assumption. And in fact, if equality is not there, none of the epistemic properties follow either, because then you have biases, you know, only certain voices are heard, only certain votes are counted. So, but you're right to push me on this, because even in that super controlled environment of a citizens' assembly, inequalities reemerge. So it's a work of every instance to maintain it and to reaffirm it, and to reaffirm it, and to re-empower the shy in the group and the former stutterer and you know, the younger people, etc. But I have to say though that it's really striking how they themselves, the citizens themselves, maintain and care about that equality, because they come in on the basis of one person, one lottery ticket, basically. So they know, they're no better than anyone else in this room. That's really baked in the design. And then when organizers of the first convention tried to create a group that was based on a different basis, it was based on willingness to address transversal issues to the group, to the 5 groups, and like the way to finance the reforms, constitutional issues, etc. And it became clear that the self-selection was on the basis of who thought that they were the natural leaders of the group. This new group was called the Squad, and it was hated by the other citizens to the point that they went to the governance committee and made a big deal out of it, and they got the governance committee to apologize and cancel that additional group. So they felt themselves that their love and the quality of their work was not going to survive the reintroduction of inegalitarian principles and the emergence of a group of natural leaders. Because of course you will have, what I find fascinating is that these assemblies are not trying to erase all differences between people. Of course there will be smarter people, more educated people, people who are natural leaders, all of that. But in fact, the citizens embrace those types as long as they are in the service of the group. but as soon as they're elevated in a position on that basis to a different position, they don't like it anymore. So it seems to me that, in fact, equality comes before love, because I'm not sure they could love each other if they didn't assume that they were equal. Something like that. So it's, I haven't totally, figured out how the two relate, but it seems to me that they're on different planes.
See that what you're describing is equality as an emotion, in fact. I mean, it's something...
Equality is an emotion?
Yeah, I don't think it's... of course it exists as a principle, but, in order for it to really do anything, it's it's something that you live and you really relate to people as, I am no better than you, you are no better than I. To actually get yourself into that as actually the way in which you are in the world is something we don't manage. I mean,
friendship, because I think friendship does demand a sort of... Yeah.
You have to like people to...
I just don't get how you can think of equality as an emotion. That part is hard for me.
Would it help to say a sense of equality, or the
recognition of
equality, which is
and
think of that as an
affective
affective state?
An affective state.
It's something
what
you
would we
live.
call it? I would need a name to...
I would call it respect, but that's... but I don't know.
But also respect is not an emotion either. It's an attitude.
I think
don't know.
Well, we do describe some people as disrespectful, right? Which is a kind of way in which they seem to engage with everybody.
But the disrespect causes an emotion, but is it an emotion itself? No.
I think that one can be struck by the value, the reality, the equality of another in an affective way. And maybe we don't have a word for it exactly, but I think respect is a word that is used to name that among other, I think it's among other uses of that word. Yeah.
Okay, but when you say I have respect for my elders or for my taekwondo master, I don't assume equality right there. So I don't know if it's connected so deeply. But I need to think more about it. Of course, I think equality is central to the ethos developed in these assemblies. Without it, it falls apart. But it's not enough, I think, to get to the outcome, I think.
I was surprised that you said that we need to presume equality in order to get love going.
Well, it's just a thought I'm just been trying out now. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, I would have thought that your view, and I commend this view to you, would have been that one way, at least one way that we can get at this sense of equality is via love. So one is what one's struck by, or what one experiences is love for the individual, and through that one can see, oh, they're
well, I
like
think that's
me
your
in the
view.
relevant. They have equal standing in the other. So I would have thought that was your way of thinking about how the sort of order of insight goes.
But I can't say that that's what I observed, because they came in equals. So they were already equals by definition. They came in on the basis of one person, one lottery ticket. It was repeatedly told to them that they were equals, that every voice mattered. So to me, the love was born on that background. And maybe it bred an understanding of equality that was deeper, that was more substantive. That's what, yeah. But look, I'm thinking back to something that Lionel Sir writes about, Madame de Sévigné writing to her daughter about some poor peasant being quartered in the public space. And she's talking about it like it's nothing, like it's, some kind of puppet being dismembered. And she cannot have empathy, she cannot have sympathy, she cannot have love, forget about love, for someone who's not our equal. So I think you need to start from a place of equality at the minimum, like the formal one. Like at least they're humans, at least they're citizens, like us, to be able to develop that bond and that sympathy. So in fact, you could say, well, it's all lovely, but we're talking about a very privileged setup where there's already all of those good things in the background. And the more difficult, much more difficult question is, okay, how do you create that sort of love between, say, Israeli and Palestinians, right? Because there's no presumption of equality between them on that level, or between, say, us and the animal world, or between white slave owners and slaves back then. Like, how do you do that cognitive and emotional leap if you don't have a premise of equality to begin with? So that's why I'm focusing on a much easier case, which is we're already assuming a democratic polity.
Well, I have been reminded that my one job is to make sure that we conclude on time. There is a buffet lunch that is being served in just a few moments, 12:30. I actually do think it's perfectly obvious that the Tanner Lectures are a tremendous milestone and an honor, so I took your words very seriously. But it is also because they choose such remarkable scholars to visit us that we should take a moment to say how honored we are that you presented it here, and to congratulate Elaine Landemore and thank her for these wonderful conversations. Thank you. And lastly, it should not be forgotten, for our sign reader who has gone through hours so that we could communicate to the broader world. Thank you.
God, that was so hard.